Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. The KHC is the only 9,000 square foot space devoted to Holocaust education throughout CUNY. And part of the building's design that you see behind me features angular glass panels symbolizing the very reason for tonight's event, to remember the night of broken glass known as Kristallnacht. Tonight's commemoration is entitled The State of Holocaust Education in the U.S. Today and features our keynote speaker, Dr. Oren Stier. We're very grateful to have the support of several elected officials and senior administrators at QCC and CUNY. And so it's my great honor to begin this evening's program by introducing the Chancellor of the City University of New York, Dr. Felix V. Matos Rodriguez.
Thank you, Laura, and good evening to everyone. On behalf of the City University of New York, I am pleased to welcome you to this evening's important and timely event organized by the Kupferberg Holocaust Center at CUNY's Queensborough Community College. My thanks to Laura and the Center, and to Queensborough President Christine Mangino. And thank you to all of tonight's co-sponsors and participants who do so much to advance Holocaust education and the study of genocide and to promote human rights everywhere in the world. This year's remembrance of Kristallnacht and tonight's conversation about the state of Holocaust education come at a time when we are all grappling with a tragic new chapter in the history of the Jewish people. For many in the Jewish community, the atrocities committed by Hamas against Israel's citizens on October 7th were painful echoes of Nazi terror. The attacks triggered a war that has brought a humanitarian crisis of historical proportions to Gaza. And they have ignited intense conflict in our country, especially on college campuses, including CUNY's. The situation in the Middle East is undeniably complex, but it cannot blur the fundamental reality that antisemitism and other forms of ethnic and religious hatred have been on the rise globally. We are not immune even here in New York City, which is home to more Jews than any place outside Israel. Among them are many with personal connections to the Holocaust, survivors and their children and grandchildren, as well as generations of family members of those who perished. Many are part of the CUNY community. For me, as a historian, the rise in antisemitism underscores the absolutely critical role of educators, scholars, and their institutions in confronting all forms of hate. At CUNY, in the past year, we have distributed hundreds of thousands of dollars for programming targeting antisemitism and other forms of bigotry on our campuses. We created a portal for our community to report incidents of hate. We form an advisory council of Jewish leaders to advise us on matters concerning Jewish life at our university. Underlying all of our efforts is a commitment to the kind of work that you all do here. Confronting hate and fostering understanding and tolerance cannot happen without the context of history, or without asking the kinds of questions you will be considering this evening. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for what I'm sure will be an enlightening and constructive discussion.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Christine Mangino, President of Queensborough Community College. I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone, especially our distinguished guest, Dr. Oren Stier, Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University. During tonight's commemoration of the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht, we will reflect upon critical questions related to our expectations of Holocaust education. Our commitment to educating people about the Holocaust has taken on even greater significance in the wake of the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas against Israeli citizens and the terrifying rise in antisemitism we are yet again witnessing around the world and in our backyard. Many within our community have direct connections to the region. I have heard of young people afraid to leave their homes out of fear of being profiled. I have spoken with many friends and colleagues of all backgrounds who are understandably experiencing heightened levels of shock, pain, and fear. I've spent the past month reflecting on the consequences of the Israeli-Hamas war. I've thought about my own children, the students we serve, and all my friends and colleagues at Queensborough. It reinforced our vital role as educators in times like these. Education empowers us to advance human understanding and find peaceful solutions. At Queensborough, we will continue our work to keep our campus safe for our Jewish students, faculty, and staff. And we are committed to the Kupferberg Holocaust Center's work to make tangible connections between the Holocaust history and our present-day society in our collective effort to overcome the obstacles that lie ahead as we combat antisemitism, racism, and other forms of discrimination and hate.
Good evening. I'm Queensborough President Donovan Richards, and on behalf of the 2.4 million residents of Queens, I welcome you to tonight's commemoration of Kristallnacht. 85 years ago today, German and Austrian Jews by the hundreds were killed by the Nazis and their sympathizers. Countless homes, businesses, and synagogues were ransacked and destroyed. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and brought to concentration camps. Kristallnacht was a prelude to the murder of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. But as time passes, there will come a time where there will be no one left among us to tell their firsthand stories of the Holocaust. That begs the question of what can be done to teach this generation and future generations about the horrors of the Holocaust. What can be done to make sure such evil never happens again? The Kupferberg Holocaust Center has been working to answer these questions. And on this anniversary of Kristallnacht, we come together for a critical conversation on the state of Holocaust education. This talk is needed now more than ever, not only in light of the recent terror attacks against Israel, but as anti-Semitism rises up across the world. If there's any hope of eliminating anti-Semitic hatred in this world, we must be effective in communicating the true nature of the Holocaust to our young people. So I thank the Kupferberg Holocaust Center for convening tonight's commemoration and discussion. And I want to acknowledge that some of those attending tonight's program personally witnessed the horrors of Kristallnacht as young children. We are so grateful for their presence and for their role in ensuring that KHC, the leading Holocaust educational center in Queens, is staying alive. I hope tonight's event leads to further advances in Holocaust education, and I hope it brings us closer to a world free of all forms of hate and violence. Thank you so much. When we say never again, we mean it.
Today, as we gather for the 2023 Kristallnacht commemoration, I'm grateful to join the leadership of the Queensborough Community College at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center for a conversation on the state of the Holocaust education in the United States. Kristallnacht, often referred to as the Night of Broken Glass, is a chilling reminder of the violent consequences of rampant anti-Semitism across the globe. According to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, violent riots against European Jewish communities resulted in the destruction of hundreds of synagogues and Jewish institutions, with an estimated 7,500 Jewish-owned establishments being shattered and looted. Jewish cemeteries became a particular object of desecration in many regions. At least 91 Jews were killed, while another 30,000 were sent to concentration camps. In remembrance of these horrific events, we continue to hold our vow to future generations, never again. With anti-Semitism on the rise around the world after the terrorist attack on Israel, we are steadfast in our mission to combat misinformation on the history of the Holocaust with awareness, education, and action. This responsibility rests on all of us, and it is why I am committed as Queens District Attorney to protect our Jewish communities from all forms of threats of violence, harassment, vandalism, and assault. From drawing swastikas on local synagogues to vandalizing public parks and memorials, to even horrific assaults on our Jewish neighbors. The rise of anti-Semitism is unacceptable and must be eradicated from our borough. In recognition of these alarming and dangerous trends, I've established the borough's first dedicated hate crimes bureau within 6 months of taking office, one of the first in the nation committed exclusively to preventing, investigating, and prosecuting hate crimes. And so when there is an incident against a Jewish victim, even if it is not deemed a hate crime by definition of the law, we prosecute aggressively. 85 years after Kristallnacht, we continue to signify the tragic consequences of the silence in the face of unmitigated hatred. And so let us reaffirm our values that every person, no matter their race, background, religion, or language, is created equal and deserves to be treated as such throughout their lives. With education, activism, and shared vision of protecting our Jewish neighbors, we will continue to combat anti-Semitism and all hate crime by collectively shaping a future of inclusivity and acceptance both here in Queens and across the globe. Thank you.
My sincerest thanks to Chancellor Rodriguez, President Mangino, Queensborough President Richards, and Queens District Attorney Katz. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Center in White Plains, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Sam and Francis Freed Holocaust and Genocide Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, the Genocide Studies Program at Yale University, the Center for Jewish Studies at Queens University, Queens College, and the Center for the Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. One final housekeeping note, please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as the chat's been disabled. And now please join me in welcoming this evening's esteemed keynote speaker. Dr. Oren Stier is Professor of Religious Studies in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University, and directs FIU's Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program, which facilitates teaching and learning about the Holocaust and other genocides through a certificate program, teacher training, community outreach, faculty research, and more. Dr. Stier is the author of Committed to Memory, Cultural Mediations of the Holocaust, and Holocaust Icons, symbolizing the Shoah in history and memory, and co-editor of a book that I love, Religion, Violence, Memory, and Place. His research addresses Holocaust testimony, Jewish memory, Holocaust education, and the material and visual culture of the Shoah and its remembrance. He has been a Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and was guest curator for a teaching gallery exhibition entitled Race and Visual Culture Under National Socialism at FIU's Frost Art Museum. In 2021, Dr. Stier served on the Florida Department of Education expert group, writing new statewide standards for Holocaust education, and he regularly leads single and multi-day workshops to educators on teaching the Holocaust. Dr. Stier, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much to Laura Cohen, Dr. Cohen, and the Kupferberg Center for the kind invitation to speak tonight. And to all the co-sponsoring organizations. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I really appreciate all of the introduction. You all did half of my job for me already, so I'm going to edit my presentation on the fly. You've heard a lot about Kristallnacht already. I hope I have something to add to the conversation. The brutal attacks of October 7th immediately brought up Holocaust analogies and a very real increase in global anti-Semitism, forcing many people in Holocaust education to question the value and efficacy of our work. While tonight's talk is not about recent events and nothing changes the facts of history, I want to acknowledge that sometimes current events force us all to pay closer attention to what and how we learn from the past. So, to start, what do we mean by Holocaust education? Do we want students to learn about the Holocaust, or do we want students to learn from the Holocaust? That is, are we teaching facts, or are we encouraging critical thinking about historical lessons? Another question, what do we mean by never again? Do we mean that never again should we suffer such persecution, or do we mean that never again should anyone suffer such persecution? Is it an empty slogan, or Does it actually mean something, especially today? I'd like us to have in mind these two framing questions as I move through my presentation and our conversation this evening, which attempts to assess the current framework for U.S. Holocaust education and critically examine some of its bedrock ideas and assumptions, including the issue of Kristallnacht. To organize my presentation, I'm going to ask us to reflect on Holocaust education's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges. First, the strengths. In the US overall, 26 states mandate some form of Holocaust education. But note that all but 9 were mandated since 2018. Here's a map showing the spread of the mandated states. Now, 4 more have pending legislation: Louisiana, West Virginia, Maryland, and Vermont. And 17 states have a commission or task force. Some of those are overlapping. And finally, 5 states have some form of permissive or optional Holocaust education: Washington, Nevada, Utah, Alabama, and Pennsylvania. So in sum, 40 states in total have some kind of Holocaust education going on. That's a fabulous number. Speaking more locally, here's a map showing all 40. Now, something more locally that in Florida, and I'll note in New Jersey as well, those were the first 2 states to mandate Holocaust education here in Florida from K through 12. And both have state-funded task force or commission on Holocaust education. Here's Florida's, here's Florida's 1994 mandate. And I'll share the language with that momentarily. In 2020, the Florida legislature updated the mandate and the language of statute 1003.42 required instruction, adding material defining antisemitism and an annual certification requirement. Here that is. And following this, the state also convened an expert group in which I participated to draft new statewide standards for Holocaust education. Before this, there were no official set standards for Holocaust education. So on the slide here, you see not highlighted the original language of the 1994 mandate, and then highlighted is the additional language in the 2020 update, which defines anti-Semitism and adds the other requirements. And I just want to highlight very briefly language from the original 1994 mandate that I found fascinating, because the 1994 legislation set out outcomes for Holocaust education in the state that, as you can see, reads, ultimately, the establishment of Holocaust studies in Florida schools is expected to play a significant role in the development of tolerant attitudes, cooperative, collaborative behaviors, informed, involved, and compassionate citizens, and other skills encouraging civility. So again, the Holocaust education standards that were implemented in legislation 2020 became effective this current school year. And finally, the new updated mandate mandated an annual Holocaust Education Week, timed to coincide with November 9th and 10th right now. This week is now Holocaust Education Week throughout the state of Florida, and it's pretty much just concluding tomorrow. So all of this naturally brings us to the discussion of what we commonly call Kristallnacht, because it's an event that's at the heart of Holocaust education. And as has been pointed out by our dignitaries tonight, we commemorate the 85th anniversary of it this evening. Alas, we typically in education don't try to understand the event of Kristallnacht sufficiently, despite the fact that it's such a strong focus. Kristallnacht means crystal night, and it's often referred to as the night of broken glass. But I'm reluctant to use the term, and I've been training myself really not to, because it's a euphemism that masks the violence and the significance of the event of what I would like us to call instead, and scholars agree with this, the November pogrom. a watershed moment in the history of Nazi Germany's assault on European Jewry that emphasizes the time frame and especially the activity, the pogrom, the wild violence against Jews. So I want to look at the November pogrom in context for the next few minutes with you. And I want to consider my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Berenbaum's apt phrase, the end of the beginning and the beginning of the end, as a way to understand the November pogrom in its context. So in order to do that, it's important to look at the preceding months, which saw a marked intensification of anti-Jewish activity compared to the previous 5 years, beginning with Hitler's appointment as chancellor and assumption of power on January 30th, 1933. So we refer to this earlier time period as the era of paper violence in the Holocaust, because during this period, Jews were progressively delegitimated, disenfranchised through a series of legal measures that were designed to identify them and exclude them from German economic, social, and cultural life. So until early 1938 or so, even though there were sporadic cases of violence perpetrated by the SA, the stormtroopers, or the brown shirts, the Nazi Party's original paramilitary wing, against Jews in Germany, large-scale state-sponsored violence did not occur. So the next important date is March 1938, the Anschluss, Germany's takeover of Austria. At that point, there was an increase of violence against Jews, as well as an increased effort to force Jewish emigration, which maybe would have worked out very well, except for the July 1938 Evian Conference, which was convened by the US, ostensibly to attempt to alleviate the European Jewish refugee problem. But unfortunately, Evian made it clear that there was widespread global opposition to increased Jewish immigration to other countries. One member of the meeting famously said, "We do not have a Jewish problem and we do not wish to import one." Nonetheless, expulsions of Jews from the Reich increased. So where could they go? Well, one answer was the border between Poland and Germany. So October 18th, 1938, Adolf Hitler ordered that more than 12,000 Polish-born legal resident Jews be expelled from the Reich in one night, dispossessed of all their belongings and capital save for one suitcase each. And then under the control of the Gestapo, these Jews were deported by train to the Polish border, where about 2/3 of them were denied entry, rendering them stateless and in limbo, stranded in a refugee camp with few resources in the border region between Poland and Germany. Why is all this important? Well, because one couple who had been living in Hanover for 27 years had a 17-year-old son named Herschel Greenspan. And he was living in Paris at the time. His sister sent him a desperate appeal for support, and that appeal reached him on November 3rd. He was outraged. So he bought a pistol and bullets, and on Monday, November 7th, he went to the German embassy in Paris, planning to kill the ambassador, but instead he was routed to the office of the third secretary, Ernst vom Rath, whom he shot, critically injuring him. Hitler himself sent his personal physician to Paris to attend to von Rath, but the diplomat died in the afternoon of the next day. Now, by then, November 8th, the morning papers had already denounced the Jewish people as murderers, and von Rath died in the afternoon. So immediately, collective punitive measures were announced. Jewish newspapers and magazines would have to cease publication. Jewish children could no longer attend, quote unquote, Aryan state elementary schools, and Jewish cultural activities were suspended indefinitely. So even though it was not until the evening of November 9th that Berliners heard the news that von Rath had died, demonstrations against the Jews in Germany had already begun. Many who discussed the November pogrom erroneously describe it as a spontaneous night of terror and destruction brought on by Greenspan's rash act and von Rath's death. But Greenspan provided only a pretext for coordinated Nazi reprisals against Jews all over Germany that were months, if not years, in the making. Indeed, in an irony of history, Hitler and many Nazi Party and SA leaders were in Munich on November 9th, commemorating their failed beer hall putsch of 1923, when they were informed of Vom Rath's death. Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels, the chief instigator of the November pogroms, wanted to use Vom Rath's assassination as an excuse to unleash mob violence against Jews all around Germany. And he reported to the assembled Nazi leadership that his murder was a world Jewish conspiracy. Goebbels told Hitler that violence against Jews had already broken out in several cities, and he recorded Hitler's response in his diary. And I quote, he decides, demonstrations should be allowed to continue. The police should be withdrawn. For once, the Jews should get the feel of popular anger. I immediately give the necessary instructions to the police and the party. Then I briefly speak in that vein to the party leadership, stormy applause. All are instantly at the phone. Now people will act. And act they did. So you can see, for example, the Gestapo leader Heinrich Müller's secret telegram to regional Gestapo offices from 11:55 p.m. on the night of November 9th. Look, for example, at clause number 3, you're to prepare for the arrest of approximately 20 to 30,000 Jews in the Reich. Wealthy Jews in particular should be selected. Further instructions will be issued in the course of the night. So these nationwide instructions for the spontaneous demonstrations were refined and clarified by Reinhard Heydrich, head of the security police, the division of the SS, who sent an urgent telegram himself to state police locations and to SA leaders in the various districts at 1:20 a.m. on November 10th, and see the highlighted portions, right? Not to endanger German lives or property. Places and businesses and apartments belonging to Jews may be destroyed but not looted, etc., etc. At 5 p.m. on November 10th, Goebbels ordered demonstrations to be halted. The order was broadcast nationwide over the radio. So during a roughly 24-hour period, more than 1,000 cities, towns, and villages throughout Germany saw these quote-unquote spontaneous demonstrations. More than 1,000 synagogues, some in towns that had already been devoid of Jews due to deportation, and about 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed and looted. Many cemeteries were desecrated. Thousands of Jewish homes were burned and destroyed. I'm sure many of you have seen the photographs that show police and firefighters standing by while synagogues burn and businesses are looted, often led by SA paramilitary stormtroopers, some in uniform brown shirts and quite a few in civilian clothes, in order to help propagate the fiction that the nationwide actions had been spontaneous, many with lists and clipboards provided to them to facilitate the identification of Jewish sites, and even school children. And when the fires threatened neighboring non-Jewish properties, photos show rioters smashing synagogues with hammers and axes, and firefighters training hoses on adjacent non-Jewish businesses in order to protect them only. See, for example, this famous photo of the Ober-Ramstadt synagogue burning while firefighters work to save a neighboring house and bystanders watch. In the end, more than 30,000 Jewish men between the ages of 16 and 60, that's a quarter of all Jewish men still in Germany at the time, were arrested and sent to Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and other concentration camps that had been established in the early months of Nazi rule to incarcerate political prisoners, where they were tortured, and more than 1,000 of them eventually died. Jews were attacked everywhere, and while the official records show only 91 were killed, more recent scholarship suggests the real number was in the hundreds, especially when considering those who died later of their injuries. The recorded number of rapes and suicides in the wake of the pogrom were also higher than what was normal for this time. But here's the remarkable thing. This wasn't yet wartime. With the restrictions on reporting and information dissemination that come with international hostilities. So The events of November 1938 were widely reported in the international news media. So, in what way can we understand the November 1938 pogrom? My notes keep cutting out every once in a while. In what way can we understand the November 1938 pogrom as the end of the beginning? The beginning of what? I want to say that the era of paper violence contributed in a major way to promoting attitudes that progressively viewed Jews as others in relation to German society. But laws also held Nazism in check. And November 9th to 10th, 1938 marked the end of this phase. My point is that the era of paper violence that characterized the early years of Nazi rule displayed Hitler's methodical, incremental depersonalization and dehumanization of Jews, taking away their livelihood, their rights as citizens, even their abilities to mingle with their non-Jewish neighbors, whether at the post office, the bakery, or just about anywhere. Nazi policies before 1938 made Jews invisible, removing them through a series of legal measures from German society, but not killing them outright, certainly not in a systematic way. All this laid the groundwork for what was to come later, but the date for the implementation of the next phase of the Nazi assault against European Jewry had not yet been determined. Since coming to power, Hitler had struggled to keep the more radical, violent wing of the Nazi Party, that's primarily the SA, the stormtroopers. He'd struggled to keep them at bay. For example, in 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, he was forced to purge the SA to cement his legitimacy as commander-in-chief of the German army. But plenty of brown shirts remained, chomping at the bit to unleash a pogrom against the Jews. The murder of von Rath was the trigger, and in this way, what we have come to call Kristallnacht marked the end of the era of paper violence, the end of the beginning. So, what are the key takeaways? How was this event also the beginning of the end? The November pogrom was a test balloon to see if German society was ready for the next step. Was it? How did German society respond? Unfortunately, in large part, the response was passivity. There was little public protest concerning the violence, though to be fair, many Germans found the public nature of the violence distasteful. Some were even indignant. Where there were negative reactions, these largely were in response to the destruction of property and valuable goods, to the economic impact of the pogroms, not to the human impact. While the Nazis had failed to make the demonstrations appear spontaneous, they had succeeded in gauging public readiness for greater anti-Jewish measures, learning to avoid the destruction of valuable property. The November pogrom also initiated an era of collective Jewish punishment, simply because they were Jews. Having been isolated through legal measures, Jews were now, in ways they had not been for a long time in Germany, identified as a distinct group. It convinced Hitler and other leaders that a more organized and intensified program of anti-Jewish policy and especially activity was both necessary and available. And in this way, it was the beginning of the end essentially of Jewish life in Germany and its occupied territories, marked eventually by systematic, state-sponsored, large-scale anti-Jewish violence. You know, the late, great scholar of the Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, famously coined a series of phrases that sum up historical anti-Semitism and the world's treatment of Jews. Many of you know them. First, you may not live among us as Jews. Traditionally, this led to forced conversion. In the modern period, particularly in Germany, it led to assimilation. Either way, leaving us with, you may not live among us. In the past, this led to expulsions. In the Nazi era, this led to encouraging Jewish immigration from Germany. But both classically and under the Nazi regime, these strategies did not solve the Jewish problem. Indeed, after the Evian conference, the Nazi Party's official newspaper proclaimed no one wants them. Until the outbreak of the war, the Nazi regime had in fact encouraged Jewish emigration, though not without severe financial hurdles. But the outbreak of war closed off this option, leaving simply, you may not live. Since no one wanted the Jews, phase 3 of a scheme initiated many, many years earlier was implemented, the, quote, final solution to the Jewish question. Jews had by now ceased to be persons under German law. In many respects, they were neither seen nor heard. Thousands could be sent to concentration camps with hardly any opposition from their neighbors, who largely saw Jewish disappearance as a gain, not as a loss, granting them access to businesses, clients, resources, property, etc. Those few who resisted the measures or who spoke out were themselves subject to harsh punishment. And those members of the clergy who spoke out, who were more immune to reprisals from the Nazis, were, sadly, too few to make much of a difference. Now, I'm going to hold here, and I'm going to come back to the lesson of the November pogrom at the end of my talk. But right now, I want to return to our SWOT analysis of Holocaust education in the US, and I want to look at some weaknesses. And my list of these include largely unfunded mandates, lack of data on outcomes, weak certification requirements, vast disparities in implementation, and lack of guidance as to how teachers should implement their mandates. And I wonder how well the US has been served by these efforts, and overall, what the outcomes have been after nearly 30 years in some cases. What data do we have on the impact of the mandates or on teacher trainings in achieving specific educational goals? How have we even accounted for and assessed the vast disparities in approaches to the mandate, ranging from a few class hours devoted to the Holocaust to entire semesters spent in elective courses? Finally, how effective are certification requirements and other feedback and enforcement measures? Unfortunately, even after, in some cases, 30 years, we don't have a lot of data. Allow me to return to my experience in the expert group drafting the new Florida statewide standards for Holocaust education. Overall, the adopted standards are spotty and don't match up with our initial 3-part proposal from January 2021. This was the initial proposal for the framework for Holocaust education standards in Florida. 3 parts: examine how prejudice, discrimination, stereotyping, and antisemitism contributed to the Holocaust. That's not how I spell it, but that's how they spelled it. 2, through lessons from the Holocaust, describe how actions of individuals, groups, and nations can safeguard against genocide. And 3, explain why remembrance is essential to understanding the lessons of the Holocaust. Now, as a syllabus for a high school history course, the standards that have been implemented are not bad, but they provide very little context overall because they barely address the pre-war causes or the post-war consequences of the Holocaust. They hardly address the second and the third items in our proposal. The adopted standards in Florida fail to address in any significant way what students should learn from the Holocaust, especially in terms of how individuals, groups, and nations can safeguard against racism, hate speech, intolerance, etc. And I think this is a much larger problem around the failure of schools to address the responsibilities and challenges of citizenship. Now, these concerns about the effectiveness of Holocaust education have been expressed on a national scale in recent years. Indeed, the explosion of new state mandates since 2018 that I noted earlier may be traced to some troubling surveys in the last 5 years. Many of you have heard in 2018, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, known as the Claims Conference, released the result of its Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness Study. And in a press release, the Claims Conference, in really quite dramatic fashion, highlighted one bombshell finding. There were over 40,000 camps and ghettos during the Holocaust. 49% of millennials cannot name a single one. The truth is there are really two bombshells here, right? Because most people are astonished to hear that the number of sites of incarceration is so high. But the point of the finding really was the second part, that nearly half of the millennials surveyed couldn't name a single one. And the survey found additional significant gaps in Holocaust knowledge, such as nearly 1/3 of all Americans, 31%, more than 4 in 10 millennials, 41% believe that substantially less than 6 million Jews were killed. That is, they believe 2 million or fewer were killed during the Holocaust. Jewish organizations were particularly worried. In March of 2020, the Claimed Conference commissioned another study, the US Millennial Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness Survey. This time, they also drilled down to the state level, recording responses from an additional oversample of US millennials and members of Gen Z from each of 50 states. Not surprisingly, given the 2-year span between the surveys, the national results were roughly the same. But what was more revealing in the 2020 survey was the state level data, further revealing poor recall of Holocaust facts and a concerning level of misinformation. To further assess Holocaust literacy, the Claimed Conference calculated what they called a Holocaust knowledge score to compare levels of knowledge and awareness in each state relative to one another. The Holocaust knowledge score, they say, is equivalent to the percentage of respondents aged 18 to 39 in each state who met the following criteria. 1, have definitely heard about the Holocaust. 2, can name at least one concentration camp, death camp, or ghetto. And 3, know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Okay, so this sounds very reasonable at first glance, right? As some sort of a minimum metric for Holocaust awareness. But I just want to point out, as was pointed out to me by my library colleagues who specialize in Boolean search logic, that the and here works as a kind of a limiting term, right? When you correlate these 3 items together with yoking them together with and, you get basically a Venn diagram where the amount of overlap between all 3 points of information or points of knowledge is actually very, very limited. So there's going to be necessarily very limited results. Sure enough, none of the top 10 states in the Holocaust knowledge score rankings did particularly well, and none appeared in the state mandate list as of 2020. The highest scoring state, Wisconsin, was only a 42%. I know that if students in my classes score 42% on something, that's considered a failing grade. So what's more concerning, 3 of the bottom 10 states, Delaware, Florida, and New York, did appear on the state mandate list in 2020. Now, granted, some of those states had only recently, some of the states overall, had only recently legislated and approved the mandate. Again, many of them, all but 9, were fairly new after 2018. And as noted already, support for and enforcement of those mandates varies quite widely. Now, we can quibble about the survey methodology and its possibly alarmist presentation, but it's certainly clear from this study at least that the millennial and Gen Z generations in the US have not learned enough of the particulars about the Holocaust, and that a troubling minority are misinformed about some of what we consider the most basic facts. Certainly, if the measure of the success of Holocaust education is whether most adults 18 to 39 can meet the Holocaust knowledge score metric, everyone is failing. And that is enough to make you want to give up. Question is this an accurate picture? Right at the same time, the 2020 Claimed Conference survey came out. Another one was also published, this one commissioned by Echoes and Reflections, which is a joint project of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the USC Shoah Foundation, and Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority. The Echoes and Reflections US College Survey obtained data from students in 4-year colleges and universities seeking to explore the relationship between exposure to Holocaust education in high school and subsequent student attitudes and behaviors in US college campuses. They wanted to try to track how much the students learned in high school that they take with them into college. And overall, the study found that students who had previously received Holocaust education in high school displayed more pluralistic and tolerant attitudes by about 10 percentage points over their peers who had not, and a greater willingness to challenge and engage with intolerant behavior, at least in private. I'll put up here on the slide just the conclusion to the study, particularly the last part in the second column. These findings have important implications for education policy and practice discussions. This is especially true for decisions on how to most efficiently and impactfully deliver Holocaust education to cultivate citizenship, values, empathy, respect for differences, and willingness to take action against hate and prejudice in today's challenging political and social environment. It sounds very relevant today. And I also just want to remind you that this is the kind of language we saw in both in the original 1994 mandate in Florida and even in the updated version, although it's somewhat a little bit buried. So it would appear that we have two very different pictures of the state of Holocaust education in the US in the 21st century, particularly among Gen Z. One would suggest that they gained little knowledge and awareness from their high school exposure to the Holocaust, and the other proposes that those who learned about the Holocaust in high school are, frankly, better citizens. All of this begs the question, what do we mean by education? What is the goal of Holocaust education? Is it really to make sure that everyone knows that 6 million Jews were murdered, to score high on a metric? Don't get me wrong. Facts are of critical importance, especially in today's age of supreme cynicism and mistrust in which facts themselves are debated. But the question is, what will that information, what will that kind of knowledge accomplish? Will it lead to less anti-Semitism in the country, in the world? Shouldn't the goal indeed be a reduction in anti-Semitic behavior, an increase in tolerance, empathy, and respect? And how do we get there? There was a lot of chatter about the two different surveys immediately following their release in 2020. The Claimed Conference survey renewed many fears about rising anti-Semitism, declining Holocaust awareness, and the general state of public education in the US. But many expressed concerns that the Echoes and Reflections survey received virtually no media attention. This view was best summarized in an op-ed in The Forward by Stephen Smith, formerly the executive director of the USC Shoah Foundation, one of the latter survey's co-sponsors, in a piece titled, "Stop the Fear-Mongering, Holocaust Education is Good and It Works." Smith criticized the Claims Conference for scaring people by setting a rigid standard for Holocaust awareness, and then, when it wasn't met, implying young adults' lack of specific knowledge about the Shoah revealed a certain degree of anti-Semitism. Denying facts about the Holocaust is anti-Semitism, he wrote. Not knowing facts about the Holocaust is not, although it is a sad indictment on our society. Let's say Jews were surveyed, and it was found that a large number did not know the number of African slaves that were brought to this continent. Would that make Jews racist? Don't reach for Google. A main point of Smith's op-ed is that knowledge is not the same thing as understanding, and that the latter must be our ultimate goal in Holocaust education. And that is to say that facts do not teach by themselves. Since the early days of my career, I've been concerned with this issue when it comes to the Shoah. Why is it that we, Jews especially, often assume that the facts of the Holocaust are so compelling that simply presenting them to students will produce the desired outcome, unless perhaps the desired outcomes are indeed that others know the facts of Jewish persecution? Why do we continually insist that teaching about the Holocaust by itself is ennobling? I want us to consider Dara Horn's essay in The Atlantic last year. The magazine cover announced Holocaust education has failed, while inside the actual title is a question followed by an answer. Is Holocaust education making anti-Semitism worse? And the subtitle was, using dead Jews as symbols, is it helping living ones? As Horn argues in her article, the bedrock assumption that has endured for nearly half a century is that learning about the Holocaust inoculates people against anti-Semitism, but it doesn't. So I want us to listen to Horn's recommendations from this article. Therefore, one, don't isolate the Holocaust from the rest of Jewish history, right? That is, it didn't come out of nowhere suddenly. If we're in our classrooms teaching the Holocaust, just starting in 1933, as if there's no Jewish or German or global history before that, it's not surprising if students think that it came out of nowhere and question its basis. Second, don't erase Jewish specificity or uniqueness. This is a really important point. It's commonly understood in Holocaust education, a common practice is to emphasize that Jews are just like everyone else. But Jews are not the same as everyone else. And in fact, no one is like everyone else. Every group, ethnic, religious, national, every group has its differences, as its uniqueness. But if one emphasizes the quote unquote normality of Jews, then in a way it feeds into anti-Semitic attitudes, right? If you say Jews are normal and then you discover somehow that they are not, that becomes a justification for mass murder. Third point, don't use the Holocaust as a stand-in for public moral education. She has a brilliant quote from the article. She writes, quote, "It flatters everyone. We can all congratulate ourselves for not committing mass murder." That is, that anything less than genocide becomes okay. If the Holocaust is the standard for understanding what morality is, then anything less than that, right, is justified, and that's a problem. Finally, don't make the Holocaust into a symbol. It's dehumanizing to be treated as a symbol, she writes. It's even more dehumanizing to be treated as a warning. And the point is that we must teach the Holocaust on its own terms, not as a lesson for something else that appears to matter more. If we finish our lessons on the Holocaust with a reference to other atrocities, where in a way we're saying these other ones are actually more important. They're the concluding point. So this brings us finally to the opportunities and challenges of Holocaust education, both inside and outside the classroom. And so that we can end on a more positive note, let me take the challenges first. When I teach teachers, I ask them, usually at the end, about the obstacles they face in trying to implement some of the techniques we have discussed. And many cite time constraints, adequate preparation, classroom management, access to materials, and lack of administrative support. But most of these issues can easily be addressed. Maybe not so easily in some cases, but certainly there are solutions. But I want to focus on issues outside the classroom. I want to highlight some more structural challenges in the constellation of Holocaust education in the US today. And these educational trends are not all specific to Holocaust education. So one is the perceived need to offer multiple perspectives on any issue. And we've seen this in the news, the school in Texas where they were pulling books related to the Holocaust because they didn't have any books that could represent the opposing view, as if the facts have an opposing perspective. Concerns about negatively impacting students. We have seen these debates, particularly in Florida, about there's a lot of concerns about students today, are being very fragile, and their emotional well-being in the classroom is of such paramount importance that we have to be careful about any kind of negative impact. over-reliance on affect-based learning. My colleagues, Brandon Hass and Becky Christ and I, we have a book chapter coming out that looks particularly, that includes this issue among several, and we call it their blanket emotionality, right? That the goal, misguided goal sometimes in a Holocaust classroom, Holocaust education classroom, is for students to have an emotional reaction, sometimes in place of the learning that needs to happen. One-dimensional approaches to difficult history, right? The idea, we also looked at this in our book chapter, the idea that let's say that Hitler as a supervillain is the sole author, right, of the Holocaust, and that it misses a lot of the nuance that's necessary for education. Fear of teaching ethics and morality is the final challenge I want to mention outside in the kind of more general sense. These are really inside and outside the classroom, but it's the concern that there's something wrong with bringing up issues of right and wrong in the classroom. Now, in the interest of time, we can defer the discussion of these issues to the Q&A if you like, but as I move to close, I'd like to just consider some of the opportunities of Holocaust education in the U.S. today that struck me as worth putting on a list and hopefully discussing with you this evening. And there are 6 of them. One opportunity, I think, is an opportunity to cultivate and strengthen our relationships with allies. This is really something that we can do more of. We certainly do this right now in the last month on campus in partnership with Hillel and other groups. It's very, very important to have allies as we try to teach what we feel needs to be taught. Second is an opportunity to explore the ways the Holocaust is relevant to students today. And this relates to the really important but complicated task of making analogies, of carefully making analogies. The human mind thinks by analogy. The human mind thinks according to differentiation, this and not that. And we can't escape that when we're teaching the Holocaust. We need to be careful. We need to make sure that we're not saying something else is the Holocaust, for example. But at the same time, the analogies are the ways that students come to find relevance. They come to find a sense of where they fit in trying to understand this history. So it's important. I want to consider as a third item that it's an opportunity just to be able to explore difficult histories against the worry, the concern about our students being fragile. I think we need to dig deeper into difficult histories, not just the Holocaust, but we need to explore what the difficult parts of our past are if we want to create a better future. Fourth is an opportunity to promote and nurture empathy, tolerance, compassion, and more in students. And this harkens back to some of the early language of the mandate that I think is underemphasized. Fifth is an opportunity to strengthen civil society and our liberal democratic freedoms and rights. These are incredibly important, and it goes back to the idea that Holocaust education mandates need to connect to the ideas of civil society and nurturing and strengthening civil society. And finally, it's really, really important in Holocaust education to take the opportunity to celebrate life and not just death, right? Very, very important when we teach about the Holocaust, not just talk about what they did to us, to be Jews, but also how Jews responded. All of the positive, life-affirming ways before, during, and after the Holocaust that remind us of the resilience of Jewish existence and Jewish identity. And so, in an era of renewed, vicious, and virulent anti-Semitism, Holocaust education is not a panacea, not a cure-all. What it is, what it should be, is a reminder that we must learn from history and not only about history. The November pogrom, what we often call Kristallnacht, occupies a position at a critical historical turning point in the Nazi war against the Jews in Germany. But it also represents a symbolic turning point in that war. The organized, premeditated, coordinated assault, not only on Jews, but on Judaism, on houses of worship, on Sifrei Torah, on Torah scrolls, revealing Nazi desires to attack the religious and moral basis of the Christian society in which they lived. We remember this day, 85 years ago, to commemorate, sadly, the day many saw that nothing was sacred anymore. And this aspect, perhaps more than any of the others, is why we commemorate this date annually. The November pogrom marked a turning point that showed what might be possible once a society ceased viewing some of its own citizens as neighbors. November 9th and 10th, 1938, showed the Nazis that most Germans and the rest of the world were indifferent to the fate of its Jews. We reflect on this date as a warning to remember that we are not indifferent, that, as I'm always pointing out to my students, if we see something, we must say something. Thank you.
Oren, this was, I was really moved when I saw you talk about some of this at the last AHO in Miami. And you and I have been talking about the topic of your presentation now for a while. And I think what really strikes me about this is how you've woven in historical memory and framing it from the perspective of why do we teach? And I wanted to ask you because one of the questions that you and I both had when we had a conversation after October 7th is, where does this leave Holocaust education now, given the terrorist attack by Hamas in Israel, and in our field, especially in some of the associations now, sort of a hardening of lines for what Holocaust education should represent going forward?
Thanks. It's a big question. You and I talked about this a little bit, and I mean, I think nothing really changes, but it becomes more acute. It's like a it sort of brings back to the foreground the pain of the Holocaust, and certainly all of the anti-Semitic acts that sort of the inevitable anti-Semitism that rears its ugly head after any time Jews are attacked, really sharpens that perspective. It makes it very, very present. And I think that's something that we can turn to an advantage, because it's not about looking at old historical reels. It's about turning on the news and seeing it in color. And it brings it home in a very, very profound and personal way. And, you know, most people of good conscience are moved, are affected, are impacted. And, you know, I'm not against completely sort of the emotional trigger, right? The opportunity to use an emotional hook to bring someone into a conversation. I just worry when that's the end of the educational encounter. But if that's something that brings people in, if someone's sympathy or empathy opens a door, that I think is, you know, unfortunately a positive step in the current climate.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that you know, one of the things that, and we talked a lot about this also, is the KHC exists in a very interesting space. We are the only Holocaust Education Center within CUNY. So we have a dedicated building, we have dedicated exhibitions, but we also sit within a university and a community college at that. And so a lot of what we experience is sometimes very different than what's happening in larger museums that are dedicated to Holocaust education, where you don't have the college the campus conversation occurring. And I say that because we spent a lot of time figuring out how to have conversations around anti-Semitism and racism last year when Kanye West was spreading anti-Semitic commentary all over social media and so forth. And it took us a long time. And I remember the first time I actually came to the KHC, one of the things that was actually very striking, there were two actually. The first was the word anti-Semitism is not even in our mission statement. It's to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. So there's automatically this assumption that anti-Semitism is baked into the work. The second piece, and I remember Bill Schulman, who founded our center, pointed out, is what are these lessons? So you were talking about, are we learning about, are we learning from? But the lessons themselves, we assume, many of us that are in the field, that means that they're tragic, but there's also opportunistic lessons that can be taken from this. And so I guess now that we're kind of heading into a new direction where, especially as we look at book banning, book burnings and a push to purge the educational system from actual historical facts so that we are catering to a more right-wing perspective, what do you see the future is now? Do you see it as working in classrooms? Do you see it in sites? Do you see it taking place on social media?
Everywhere. I mean, all of the above, right? I think we have to have a multi-pronged approach. We have to go to where the information or the disinformation is being spread. We have to find ways to work with tech companies and media to somehow counteract the algorithms that feed people lies and misinformation and more lies and misinformation. We have to work to change the cultural climate and environment that has become so incredibly cynical about fact, about history, championing a historical kind of ignorance, championing ignorance in general. I mean, that's never good. It's never good for Jews, and it's never good for anyone. And so, I appreciate very much where you're coming from. Although we don't have a center at FIU, my very modest program is based in a very large public university, and we don't have that kind of separate kind of institutional museum-like sort of setting. We're very, very much embedded in the university and university culture. Thankfully, the university, our university president, I want to give a big shout out to President Ken Jessel. He's a signatory to the document signed by over 100 university presidents that is, the direct opposite of the kinds of unimpressive, to put it politely, response of presidents of, let's say Columbia, Harvard, Penn, that really, I'm very proud of the kind of the position that FIU takes in the community and in the world. And so, we have to be, Holocaust education needs to be engaged and not be detached. We can't assume really anything about what people know or don't know. That's part of something what I was trying to address even in tonight's presentation. We really have to think through everything that we're doing, and in different circumstances. I'm a big believer in beginning with the end in mind, right? Start with thinking, what is the goal for this particular class, for this particular unit, whatever it is, and how do I want to get there, and what will allow us to achieve that? And I encourage the students and the student teachers, the teachers that I teach, to do the same, and that has to be part of our work.
So to kind of build on that, we have a question from a colleague. What do you consider to be best practices, not just in K through 12, but really in higher education, in the light of some of the challenges, many challenges that are roiling academia and college campuses right now?
I don't want to be flippant, but I mean, kind of everything I just talked about. I think, look, it is about coming to terms with the difficulty of difficult history and not shying away from it. Not being afraid to take things where they naturally would logically lead in terms of a pedagogical agenda. It is about engaging on various levels of representation, right? Using different kinds of media. I'm a big fan of material culture, visual culture, using testimony material, and particularly as we see the survivor generation passing away, it's going to become even more important to use good quality resources to achieve our educational objectives. And particularly for this generation that does not read as much and does not learn as much through reading, operating on those other registers becomes even more important. And you could do a lot with a little, but it's really important to do that work. It's very problematic to take a photograph, let's say, and decontextualize it. You're doing a disservice, I think, education, when you're just kind of using photographs to illustrate something and you're not giving the context. So, one of the things I wanted to try to do tonight, for example, was to have us really examine in much more detail what the November pogrom really was and where it came from. And much of that was based on Martin Gilbert's fine book. I don't claim any kind of original research here. I'm just trying to help tell a story, because this is exactly the sort of thing I try to model, certainly in a university classroom. And also teaching has to be age appropriate, right? We struggled in Florida in the expert group. I mean, Florida has a K through 12 mandate, but right now the standards say nothing about K through 4. Why? In a nutshell, because the Department of Education didn't agree with us about what would constitute the content for K through 4 learning in Holocaust education, which is not Holocaust specific content. It's inappropriate. So instead, it was what they called character education. And they said, well, we're not responsible for that. So they couldn't put that in there. We really felt strongly that, especially given that the mandate is K through 12, we have a responsibility to begin some kind of through line starting in kindergarten that will eventually prepare students beginning in 5th grade. I would prefer a little later. I lost that battle. When they start actually learning the content, learning, the basic rules of kindergarten, rules of civil society. I mean, don't steal somebody else's toys. Say please and thank you. All these things, they're relevant, right? They're relevant. Holocaust education has to plug into the goals of civil society and creating a better citizen, and we shouldn't shy away from that fact.
I think that's a really important point. And just looking at some of the comments that are and questions that are coming in, and I think that early on, before the war broke out, we had scheduled a professional development workshop on having difficult conversations in the classroom. And that seems to be something very difficult to do right now. And you and I spoke about how is it possible for us as educators and people leading these centers to embody the kind of dialogue that we wish to see, and how can we talk about difficult conversations right now, especially politically, where our field is starting to fracture in a way where multiple things can be true at the same time and contradictory. And I guess, in sort of, wrapping up for the conversation, what do you think we can do to meet this moment, and how do you right now feel about even doing this work? I mean, I'm feeling afraid and concerned on many levels, and being asked to do things that are troublesome in a way. Where do you get your inspiration, and what guidance do you have for us as we go forward?
Wow. Okay. Another really good big question. I I a friend asked me recently how I was doing, a colleague, um, after October 7th. And I wrote, I went through my shock and my sorrow, and I'm beginning to find my voice. And so, first of all, it's a process. It's a process for everyone, and everyone moves at a different pace, and that's okay. It has to be okay. Um, and I found some courage personally in speaking to this colleague because it's someone who I think would very possibly represent a kind of view that, you know, a a a view that I think is blind to the realities of Hamas, is blind to the horrors, the true horrors of October 7th, and is somehow minimizing them um, out of a misguided sense of responsibility for Palestinians as the underdogs. And I felt like I was finding my voice in speaking to this person about fact, about what is real, what has been documented, and to not shy away from that very, very difficult conversation. And I think that's our responsibility now as Holocaust educators, is to have those very difficult conversations. Um, I find my own, my own politics shifting very rapidly. And I respect those who think differently, but one has to understand the reality, the truth of the situation, however hard it is to talk with a colleague about those issues. And I get my strength or my inspiration, shall we say, from the unbelievable sense of unity in the Jewish world right now. Um, we call that achdut, right? Which is, I don't know, sort of togetherness, unity. Um, and particularly you see what's going on in Israel and how everyone is coming together. All of the political debates of a couple of months ago have dissipated. They'll probably come back, but right now, there's this amazing sense of unity and purpose, and that's inspiring. That's inspiring to me, and I think that's important in the work that we do. And I think finally, allies who speak up give me a lot of encouragement and strength. People maybe you don't expect to speak up, and who do, and it's the flip side of those very difficult conversations with colleagues or friends, right? Those who speak up and support uh, and express their support, that's profoundly encouraging. So that's a little bit of an answer.
Thank you. And I just want to have one other question, which is, the United States, the White House released their guidelines to combat anti-Semitism, not long before the war broke out. So there's a question about, do you think it would ever be possible to have a national Holocaust curriculum requirement that might get around a lot of the local and state issues that you're facing, or is that even practical?
Yeah, it's getting further into kind of the weeds of educational policy. I don't know. I mean, I think there could be a national resource center. A lot of a lot of places are just doing unnecessary work, duplicating, replicating a lot of kinds of resources. I think it would be great to have more centralized, and I think the USHMM is doing a lot of this work. And I think the what's it called, the Never Again Act is really helping with that. The U.S. does not currently have, correct me if I'm wrong, a national education standard, right? The states are free to create their own state systems. So it would be odd if this issue would somehow trump all of these kind of state controls. So I don't know about a national standard, but some national suggestions could be really helpful, and again, just, not to keep replicating. You see so many people replicating resources, curricula, outlines, you name it. And, that would be great to not have to have so much of that going on.
I agree. I mean, I think that was the gift of the pandemic, is being able to collaborate. That's why there's so many centers that signed on to co-sponsor this evening for that very reason. I've always felt, I'm at the KHCs at Queensborough Community College. And so there's things that we do really well, and the things that we need support with or don't know how to do. There's so many colleagues in our field that do this. Dr. Stier, thank you so much for giving so freely of your time and your insights. Very, very grateful. And thank you to everyone who tuned in this evening.
Thank you to all the co-sponsors. I hope you'll give me a copy of the Q&A. I see that there's a lot that we didn't get to. My email was on the last screen. If anybody wants to contact me, I'd be happy to receive your inquiries that way as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, we thank you all, and stay safe and be well.